Using that as a constraint, the eighth note pattern. Okay, so in this video I'm going to be showing off something that I'm working on for mostly my singer students and for people who want to learn to create their own piano arrangements or be in a band or anything that has to do with chords and not reading music, more like the theory, chords, improvisation stuff. So one of the things I want to mention, what you'll see here in this is, what you'll see that I do is, the first thing I'm starting off with is major scale. So this is the only thing that I'll explain in detail, but the way that I teach major scales, now I'll do it in D because C is just a river of white notes, but in D flat, I would take just the second finger and I would have them play each key with one finger scales. The reason for this is as soon as you go into proper position, your hand covers the keys and you don't see the shape of the key in the same way that you do when you're doing it with one finger. So after I do that, then I treat it like a 3-year-old would. Take your second finger and trace the shape. Don't hit the keys, just touch them, and so you can see the shape. So that if they close their eyes and they visualize a piano, they can trace the shape of D flat major. And so that's what I want them to be able to do. So that's how I teach all scales to start off with. After that, you can go ahead and add proper fingering. So again, back to the key of C here. Something that I might have a beginner do if they're very unfamiliar with this kind of stuff, I might have them just take their 2 fingers on C's and just alternate 8th note. And then from there, I would start having them increase and use more notes here, using that as a constraint, the 8th note pattern. You know, and if you want to get more involved, you could teach them like where the 4 chord is and do something like that where they're just not, just using those fingers and just listening. And again, hearing the distance, you feel the jumps in a different way when you're using just the second finger. So again, that's all I'm going to mention in great detail. The second thing I have here is I have the chord scale. And then the Roman numerals below it, uppercase for all the major, lowercase for all the minor. And then next step down, we have the major triads, minor triads. I just want them to see that like separated. So they see the 1 through 7 there, but then they see it broken up. The 1, 4, and 5 is major, the 2, 3, and 6 is minor, all basic stuff. The primary chord scale is, the way that I wrote that on the top, I want them to see that if they're just taking the major triads, 1, 4, 1, 4, 5, 1, 5, 1, C, F, C, F, G, C, G, C, they can add that to their scale. And then when they do that on the 2 chord, they're actually creating a D minor 7 chord. But again, that's too advanced for this first basic page. I just want them thinking they're having a major chord over a different bass note. And then the CS there is for common substitution. So like the C over E, a lot of times you're listening to a pop song and like the 3 chord, it's not minor, it's actually a 1 chord with the 3rd in the bass. And then almost always for the 7 is almost always going to be substituted with a 5 chord with the 7th note of the scale in the bass. So that is it for the primary chord scale. Then getting into the major sus chords. On the 1 and 5, you can do the sus2 and sus4. And just explaining to them, you're replacing the 3rd with the 2nd or the 4th note. But on the 4 chord, you can't do a sus4 and stay in the key. So I didn't include it there, and I explained to him that it can possibly work. It might show up in the song somewhere, but that's not part of the key. So it's not like a thing that you can do safely and it's just going to work every time. But like the sus2 and the sus4 work pretty much every time. Now, second page is extensions and enhancements. So this is where I start talking about what can we add to the chords. So the first thing that I tell my students that you can add to a major chord is the 9, and with a minor chord, it's the 7. Almost always you can add a 9 and a 7 and it'll sound good in pop music. So with the add 9, I start that first one just adding it as the second. So if they know their pentascales, they can just drop their hand and leave off the 4th finger. If you want to see the add 9 on top, I have it in that shape. and then I have this like this thing that kind of shows up a lot. I see that happen a lot, and it sounds nice when you do it on piano. So that's just taking the 9 up to the 3 and down to the 1. 6 chords, just explaining that, and then I give them a little example, kind of falling down. So it might be something like 6s. I find often are like they're like melody notes. They're sung, and so when you're doing a piano, creating your own arrangement, you might want to include that there. All right, so 7th chords I always like to teach as a triad over a different bass note. So when they're building the C major 7 chord, I'll say take the root, drop it an octave, and you'll see the E minor. And that way they can play the E minor in any inversion. So I try to teach them very quickly, what's the third of the chord? If you can very quickly think of the third of the chord, you're going to play in a major 7 chord that minor triad over the bass note, and that'll create the major 7. The other way I like to explain it, and it clicks sometimes differently for each, but just play your C major chord, but take your root wherever it is and drop it a half step. So they're going for the C chord, just throw that thumb out and hit that flat, just drop that root a half step. So explaining to them that that works on the 1 and the 4 chord, but not the 5 chord, because again, that would take you out of the key. Minor 7 chord, same thing, but in reverse. Think of the third of the chord, and now it's a major triad over a different bass. Or you're going for your minor triad and dropping the root a whole step. Minor 9s and dominant 7s I don't get too involved in because they don't show up that often, and by the time that they're going to start adding 9s and stuff, they don't really need these sheets. So I don't know if it was a good idea to do that, but like just treat it as like an F major 7 chord over a D would create your D minor 9. But I also like these where you have like the 5th in the bottom and you kind of roll them up. So I put those in there. Dominant 7s, I'll just explain that as I go. Major triad with dropping with a flat 7. The leading tones, so I'll always put like a little abbreviation. So as you see in there, I'll write like 1 chord and then LT. LT is for the leading tone. I think that's what you call these. So the leading tones, I just tell them here, like whatever note's in the chord, you can have that note in the bass. It doesn't change the chord, but it just kind of changes. It almost sounds like a chord change as you're moving through, but you can kind of create a little bit more movement that way. So now the last page is all like the discovery stuff, and the important thing here is to teach them that all the math is the same every key, no matter where you go. So like when you go from a 4 to a 5 chord or a 5 chord to a 6 chord, you can always add a passing chord. You can always add that note, and that note will always be the third of a major chord. So when you're going from F to G, you can pass through with a D over F sharp. And then same way when you're going to the 6, you can use the G sharp as the major third of E, and then you get your like a flat 7. And I put through the add 9 in there because, again, this is like a more advanced thing. So that's like a thing. Eagles do that a lot. Things like that. And then these are all just little examples that I have running through. And again, it's not to give them everything that's ever going to show up inside the key of C, but it's just enough to get you talking about all the different things that could potentially happen. So like where 3 chords can sometimes be major, 5s instead of being major will be minor. Same thing with the 4, all that stuff. Towards the bottom in C, I get into secondary dominance, and that's what the SD is for. Little things like that. I'll definitely mention when you play the 4 chord over the 5th, because that's like, I call that like the James Taylor chord, because he uses that like in every song. But again, these are all just little examples. So this is to be paired. Now, a beginner might only need page 1. A more intermediate student could take the first 2 pages and start getting into the extensions, and then a more advanced student can start understanding all the theory and concepts that are discussed in page 3. So I might not give every student like all 3 pages, but page 1 and 2 should pretty much go to everybody. Now, how would I use this in a song? Well, now we'll go to something like, I'll just grab like, we'll grab Hallelujah. So this is another thing that I'll make up for them, where I'll just give them lyrics and chords. And in the right hand, I give them kind of a key there with the scale and the chords that might show up. So this doesn't need to say verse chords. Oh, this is a PDF. All right, I'll change that later. But I might give them the chords that are in the song in the order, like C chord's the 1, F's the 4, the 5, and the 6. And then leave a little space, and like that E chord comes in later and a G sus4, just showing them the notes that are in there so that they quickly have access to that information if they're not familiar with it already. But the other handout will give them more options. So from here, the way that I teach these are just start long tones, just root position as they're going through it. Okay, and then from there I will teach them try to keep the common tones in the same place. So when you pick your C inversion, so if I start in root position, I'll ask them, does that have any notes in common with the A minor chord? Yes, it has a C. The C is on the bottom. Let's keep it on the bottom. So from there, we'll know that we just have to move our G up to A. And then when we go to the F chord, we're going to take, it's got two common tones, the A and the C. So we'll just move that middle note. And then when we go to a G, everything moves up or everything moves down. Everything has to move one direction or the other because there's no common tones in a note that's only letter name apart. So that's about it. That kind of reminds me one thing that I should talk about at the end. But so that's a constraint I set up, is if there's a common tone, think of what that common tone is and keep it in the exact same place. After they have that, then you can start doing some basic rhythms. And then you can start talking about more substitutions. So I'll use this as a general guide here. But like, let's say, you know, when we get to the Baffled King composing Hallelujah. Now that next thing, Hallelujah, sometimes I'll put it in parentheses because it's not necessary. You could just get right into the Hallelujah. You could just go right into the F chord, but you could also go so you go. So I might teach them like, hey, you could keep a E on the top, and then here I did like it's kind of like a C add 9 over E. Hallelujah. And I might write stuff like that in, or, you know, where you can, anytime a C is going to an F, hey, go to the leading tone thing, and then you could have that. And then throw that into the music too. And then if you want to start getting a little more fancy, you could get start getting them to work the melody in. So things like that. So that's about it. I will almost always have them at least figure out the melody within, you know, maybe even using the one finger, just find it. Can you hear the skips and where all that stuff goes? But I'm going to go back to one last thing on the C major stuff and things. So the chord scale, one thing I might do here is, what I'll tell them is start on a C chord and then go to a D minor chord and then go back to a C chord and go to an E minor chord, but keeping the common tones. Back to C, F keeping the common tones, C to G, C, A minor, C, B, C. And what I'll try to get them to realize is that if a chord is a letter name apart, a letter name up or a letter name down, there are no common tones. But any other distance, they will share at least one common tone there. So that's another important thing. So I'll use like an anchor chord. So C to D, C to E, C to F. You could do the same thing with the 4 chord. 4 to 5, 4 to 6, 4 to 7, 4 to 1, 4 to 2, 4 to 3, and keep going back. Just pick a different anchor chord and move to every single chord within the key. And that starts to get you comfortable. And depending on what inversion you start on, that'll give you lots of other options. So anyway, that's my little introduction. That's what I'm using this for. If it's helpful to you, awesome. If not, that's cool too. If you have any feedback or suggestions or things that you think I missed that I should include, I'm happy to hear that too. But at this point, I think I've covered everything that I feel like I want to put into this. So that's it for now. I will be getting these in all 12 keys eventually and posting those on my Facebook page, the studio page. So you can check that out. And like I said, I have 3 keys so far, and I'll keep them going. All right. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. Peace.